Today the format will be slightly different than yesterday, where we had these two thematic panels. We will have one panel today with 4 presentations, hopefully 4 presentations, that are all going to speak, let's say it's going to be less specific to a certain, let's say, location or case, or even specific topic, but dealing more abstract in the meeting point between signifiers and let's say modes of address within the political and within the cultural or artistic field. So we're going to, as we wrote, look at really the shift between. Is it enough? Can you hear me? Okay. Shall I start over? Okay. So to look at the kind of oscillation between, as we put it in these pairings, identification and identity, which we obviously touched upon yesterday, politics and populism, that we touched upon a little bit, and then of course affect and aesthetics, which we haven't touched upon so much, and how these are terms that are useful in the construction of a we, in the terms of mobilization, but also in, let's say, the construction of the people as such, the entity of the people, how that in itself as a political body, but also as a metaphor or a symbol, is addressed differently and produced differently through, say, both the aesthetic and the politic, not as difference, but the aesthetic and politic as two sides of the same project. So, first speaker will be Nina Power, sitting here. I'll give the floor to you, Nina.
Thank you. I couldn't be bothered to stand up. So anyway, I want to start. Well, I'm going to talk about, I guess, a particular concept of the public, or 2 concepts of the public, which relates, I think, to some of the themes of the conference. And I've got 20 minutes, yeah?
Yeah.
All right. So before I do that, I want to read a couple of things, one of which is part of a statement by an art group called Pilangalia Collective, who some of you know. And one of their projects is this band called We, where they basically take pop songs and they change the I to we, and they sing them. And I just want to read part of their statement. The project investigates the latent politics of the love song and the construction of its liberal subject. Songs about me and you become songs about us. Intimacy becomes a form of collective action and the unique universal. Despite being the mass product of an anonymous culture industry, the very premise of the pop song is one of extreme individualism, elevating the one subject of romantic desire above any other, and declaring one moment in time more significant, when I first saw you, than any other. As a result, even though the pop song is often the outcome of the labour of producers, engineers and technicians, it is associated with the strong fictional character of the pop star. And the second thing I want to read out is a piece by my friend Damir, which is talking about the protests in Bosnia and the form of collective organising that sprung up around these protests. And this is a form of organising which is called the Plenum, which has this sense of fullness and a kind of collective meeting. And these are very effective, and I'm really bored about talking about failure and I'm really interested in things that work, and I think I'm interested in really existing collective forms of action that actually achieve something, even if what they achieve is destructive ultimately. So I'm really into riots and this kind of thing. Anyway, but I want to read something that Damir wrote about the Plenum. So what's happening in Bosnia is amazing. So you're having these huge protests, which often involve the burning. I think Boris mentioned it yesterday, actually. The burning and destruction of government buildings. You get police officers changing sides, which very rarely happens. You get government ministers resigning, and so on. And behind all this is the Plenum. This is what Damir says about the Plenum. Plenums are public gatherings open to any citizen, through which collective decisions and demands can be made and action taken beyond guarantees of leadership. They are open, direct and transparent democracy in practice. Plenum as the form of self-organisation and the method of work in which citizens come together to articulate demands is underpinned by the action of the protests. The threat of protest legitimises the plenum. People now recognise that the open and transparent model of plenum work, in which decisions about the commons are made without prohibitions to speech and without leadership, is a way out of corruption, hopelessness and poverty. First and foremost, the plenum is a setting for speech beyond prohibition and censorship. This type of setting is crucial to fight corrupt privatisation, the fear it instills when it comes to making decisions about the commons. The plenum model of work creates a different public language by enabling people who have withdrawn from public life as a result of war and the so-called transition to democracy to have a say about the matters that concern them in everyday life. The plenum is a public space where demands for equality through calls for a different kind of justice are spoken. This is the ethics of the plenum. And one of the things I'm really interested in the moment, partly because I spent a lot of time in court over the past few years supporting people who are being charged with public order offences, was thinking about the concept of the public that the law uses. And when we think about the public in this kind of whimsical, generic way, you should never forget, I suppose, that someone else always has a much more efficacious and material concept of the public that they will use against you. So I spent a long time thinking about who the public of the public order charges were, and it struck me that the law needs to invoke a particular concept of the public. It's not a real public, it's a kind of ghost public. The law can't say we can do this because we're the law, right? It's too blatant, right? So it has to invoke this kind of ghost or fantasy public, who is the public of public order. So this ghost public are basically supposed to be this kind of imaginary community, I suppose, who are always like upset or offended whenever there's a breach of the peace or even the threat of a breach of peace. And when we're talking about definitions of violence, for example, it's always the law who gets to decide what violence is. So they will say, for example, that the threat of violence is violent. In fact, it's more violent than what they do. So I just became very interested, I suppose, in this concept of the public. Who is this public, the public of public order, given that it's always invoked as a way of punishing people in the streets? So I want to say, of course, the concept of the public is very problematic. And you might want to say, you might want to dismiss it. You might want to say, right, there is no public. You know, I think the bourgeois public sphere or public art, who is the public of those things? It's not really a real thing. At the same time, I mean, there are, I suppose it sounds very naive, there are actual members of the public who immediately become kind of individualised and taken out of their collective setting when the law wants to punish them, basically. So when the law gets kind of obsessed with this kind of punishing the individual, like the bourgeois legal subject, it has to name them. At the same time, it punishes them precisely because they're part of a group. This is why people in the riots went to prison for like 18 months for stealing a bottle of water, right? Because it's not because of anything to do with the individual act, whether it's throwing a banner stick or whatever. It's nothing to do with that. It's precisely punishing you because you are part of a collective. And they say this, the judges admit this in their summaries and their judgments. They basically say things, you know, like, your action is amplified by the threat that lies in the weight of numbers, and this kind of thing. And I think, I don't know, for all our hand-wringing about collectivity in the public, I think we have to, in a way, start from the position of what the law does whenever there's even the slightest hint of any kind of collective action. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is the relationship between different types of protests. So I'm very interested, for example, in the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening in America, but also here, where you have, on the one hand, sort of elements of symbolic politics, so the die-ins, like to say, this could be me, right? It's obviously a demonstration of the asymmetrical violence that is meted out to black people. This is why it's Black Lives Matter, not All Lives Matter. So you have a symbolic dimension, but you also have a really direct and material intervention into the workings of everyday life. So when it's about actually shutting things down, like malls or streets or transport hubs, I mean, you're directly intervening and saying, like, this system cannot continue, right? The everyday running of something is what's wrong, right? The everyday is the emergency, the everyday is the crisis, and it cannot carry on, right, until these things are fixed. And this is not the kind of politics which is the A to B march where you hold a banner and say, not in my name, or some, you know, liberal bullshit. It's literally like intervening in the direct workings of things and pointing out that the very fact that things continue to go on is what's wrong. And I'm very interested in these kind of forms of collective action, which are, on the one hand, a sort of relationship between your the way in which you are specifically treated asymmetrically, right, at the same time as having this kind of generic and collective dimension, in which you take on the kind of standpoint of those who are treated differently, and you yourself could be that person. Yeah, some stuff. How long have I got?
Oh, we have another 10 minutes.
Yeah. What shall I talk about? I don't know. What do people want me to talk about?
Nina, can you talk a bit more about this this legal public? I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, maybe through examples or not sure. But
What do you mean? The way in which the law invokes the public?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So think about the very idea of public order offences, right? So for example, violent disorder or riot is the more serious one, but violent disorder is the one they normally use against protesters and rioters, which involves this idea of the threat of violence, which is basically magnified or amplified through it being a collective action or threat of collective action. So basically, if you're on a protest and you throw a banner stick, the very fact that you're in a crowd, it magnifies the offence, right? If you walk down the street and threw a banner stick, right, on your own, wouldn't matter, right? Right, so, not really. And especially if it didn't hit anyone or hurt anyone, right? Let's say, you know, let's talk about relative violences. But, okay, so the way in which public order offences work is by invoking this image of a public who is offended, right, on behalf of the law. So the law has to invoke this image of a kind of silent, worried, anxious public, like constantly, right? The public that is upset by a breach of the Queen's peace. How big is her peace? Like constantly. So you have to, because the law can't literally say we can just do what the fuck we want because of the law, right? Because that just seems a bit too fascist. So, you know, at least in English and Welsh law, you know, you have to have this kind of pretense that there's someone or something, right? So that this is the smooth running of things, you know. So the public, I mean, the public of the public order is the same public who's always upset and outraged in this media sense, or it's the hardworking families. It's, you know, this fantasy construction of like a non-existing collective, right? So I think the issue is, and I must admit I'm feeling a bit frustrated with this conference, or maybe all conferences in general, or maybe with myself, I don't know. All of these things at once. I just think, you know, it's not realistic for us to have these like vague general discussions about, you know, what we or collectives or publics are without looking at the way in which they're mobilised and used in a violent way all the time. Do you know what I mean? Like, we can't escape that. You know, it's, you know, who is the public of England and Wales? It's, you know, it's not immigrants, it's not asylum seekers, it's not, you know what I mean? It's like, this is an absolutely exclusivist model which is violently used like every day. Like, you know, my friend has this great line, he's like, the quickest way to turn a liberal into a communist is to take them to court for a day. And it's absolutely true. You sit in a court and you're like, what the fuck? This is just horrific, honestly. And I recommend everyone do it in a way, because, you know, this is like reality, you know. It's like, this is how you construct publics. This is how you construct images of, you know, a scared, kind of privatised, atomised public. Is through this threat of the other, right? Through the threat of the criminalised other, or the, you know, and this is like happening all the time. And do you know what I mean? I'm just bored of this hand wringing and shit. I don't know. Sorry, maybe I'm just in a terrible mood and this is bad, right? And what I'm doing is awful, isn't it? I don't know. I'm probably a bad person, I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Just jump in.
Yeah, why not?
Dave's on his way.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very much with you. And having sat on in the courtrooms on two continents, sort of looking at the way in which this sort of repeats itself constantly. But I wondered about your conception of this other public, the scared public, as fictional. I wonder if we can kind of unpick that a little bit because there's
I'm not saying it's not real, but I'm saying the amount of work it takes to demolish, any form of solidarity.
Yeah.
Like why do we like films like Pride and shit? Because it's a fantasy of like a recent image, imagination of like what it was to have some sense of solidarity.
Yeah.
And like the amount of work it takes to destroy collective feeling. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a brutal project, right? Mm-hmm. This is what they've done.
Yeah.
No?
But I'm sort of wondering about that fiction of the anxious public because of the relationship between the creation of the fiction and then its lived reality, which is that people watch those representations on the media and all of the rest and become somehow also that worried public or those worried new collectivities. And so I'm quite interested in sort of any forms of solidarity that you've looked at that are sort of linking to these so-called worried citizens, because I think on some level they are a complete fiction and fabrication, and on the other level they are created through those narratives. They come into being in some cases.
Yeah. Well, I think that's
narratives, and quite I think that's a terrain of work also.
No, I agree. But this is why it's interesting to go to places like Sarajevo and Zagreb and see occupations and see plenums in action. Where there is literally cross-class, cross-generation, absolute kind of commitment, like day after night, every night, for months on end. You have the plenums with hundreds of people,
And the worry turns on the state. I mean, I think that's the point about anxiety and worry is.
And they win. The point is they win. Of course, we can talk about reactive politics. Of course, we're always reacting to everything. This is part of the problem. Even doing court support and legal defence work. I mean, this is a problem because you're constantly in this position of like reacting to what's being done to you. And it's like, it's fucking tiring and it's unbearable, really. And what you want is to like get ahead of it, but you can't, And I mean, like what's happening with the response to austerity is that you have like the formation, like the constructed forced formation of negative collectivities. You have millions of people who are negatively affected by these things, right, in different ways. Your disability allowance is cut, your child benefit is cut, you've lost your job, right? So you're using a food bank, right? So everyone is forced into these very depressing, individualized responses and relations to austerity. And people are literally dying and people are killing themselves, right? But you don't get then a sense of like getting ahead of it. You are constructed as like the negative collective. And like this is why, it's important to look at like victories and like what happens when you do have like real collectives that actually work together. And it's not about the elimination of differences. If anything, it's precisely about the preservation of differences. Do you know what I mean? Like I think we're so stupid when we talk about this. We think it's like either or. It's either, everyone's the same and there's some sort of like, I don't know, universal collective revolutionary moment in which all differences are subsumed, or there's just like banal neoliberal individualism. And it's like, no, you could have something else, which is like, where people are together, but they're not like, it's not about, I don't know, eliminating differences, or, do you know what I mean? I think this kind of model of scarcity, well, like the victory that the right has had is getting people to think in terms of scarcity of ideas or poverty of ideas, That's the real victory.
I think there's... in terms of the law, I think there's of course two, what you point out, what I think is interesting, there are two moments happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, of course, it's the you're being individualized, so you're always being tried as an individual.
Yeah.
So even if you do something as a collective, you're being tried as an individual. Any collective that's politically organized, you're still a number of individuals when you're a political subject in terms of the law, which is different, of course, from the corporate model. So on the one hand, there's the denial of the collective, but then on the other hand, the punishment is more severe because you're part of that collective, right?
Yeah.
So
That's the point.
this is what I think is, so there's actually a double move. On the one hand, you become individualized, but at the same time, the fact that you refuse to be individualized by being in the collective means that you'll be punished even more,
Yeah.
right? So because your crime is worse because it's part of a political action or a collective action.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what happens. I mean, sometimes even the law, even in its obsession with the bourgeois legal subject, it sometimes forgets that. So, for example, UK and Cut, one of their actions, they basically tried to prosecute like 145 people at once. You know, they didn't even name them. And they like, basically everyone had to turn up at the court. And, you know, it doesn't even work because you can't fit that many people in the box, you know. And then the law the CPS were like, oh, okay, no, you're right, we can't punish them as a group. We have to punish individuals, named individuals. So they were like, oh, we need to identify 20 ringleaders. And they did this by saying, well, this guy had an umbrella. This woman had 20 leaflets. You know, these absolutely ridiculous ways of like somehow making someone the ringleader because they can't think otherwise. You know, they have to precisely try to construct individuals whilst wanting to punish. Like, think about the riots. You know, you had 24-hour courts. You know, the courts were kept open. Like, people were immediately put in custody so that they couldn't get legal advice and they couldn't get support from friends and family. Like, absolutely immediately isolated and then immediately imprisoned, right, for the most minor of things, right? And this is how you do it, right? This is how you punish individually and collectively at the same time, right?
And I find it fascinating what you say, that it's also done through signifiers. So how do you identify a ringleader? Oh, there must be some signifiers, visual signifiers, and then in this case there are leaflets, umbrellas.
No, sure.
You wanted to say something up there, or yeah, this one. Sorry.
Okay. What can I get your? What do you think of the precariat, and do you think it's useful?
Burn it. You mean the concept?
Or just
All right.
I'm happy with you stuff.
I think it's obviously recognising something that we identify, and I mean, you know, most people's work has been precarious, and I suppose, I mean, it's a kind of, I mean, it's identifying a tendency, isn't it? So, you know, the tendency for work to be unpaid or badly paid, or, you know, like everything tends towards a 0 hours contract or whatever. You know, I mean, people talk about it in the art world because the art world can't help but talk about itself. But, so the intern becomes the model of all thought or whatever. But I guess there's a whole other world outside of the art world.
Yeah, I wasn't being specific to the precarious artwork. I was just talking about this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, you know, as a tendency, yeah, of course. I mean, if they didn't have to pay you, right, they wouldn't, you know. Like, even like a wage is like, you know, of course they don't want to pay you. It's not, you know, the entire point is that they don't, you know. They barely pay you, right, as it is. So if they don't have to pay you, they won't. So, I mean, the issue would be, how do you organise the precariat, right? And again, it's about how do you smash any form of, like, collective resistance, right? So I got obsessed with agency work because you know, when I was younger, I did agency work because it was the thing to do. It's very feminised. It's kind of, you know, they brand flexibility and lack of holidays and lack of, you know, pensions or whatever as a positive thing, you know? This is like, you're independent, you know, you're flexible. It's like, actually you're really not. You basically get rung up at 7 o'clock and told to go somewhere where no one will bother to learn your name because you're only going to be there for 5 days. You know, do you know what I mean? So I think, and I love the fact that when they started job agencies in Italy, people firebombed them because they knew what it meant, right? So, like, all the work that is done to destroy any form of, like, solidarity or collective feeling. You know, what does it mean to work in somewhere where you know your colleagues? What, like the idea of the university, for example. You know, do you solidarise with the cleaners who you don't see who are there at 5 a.m? Do you, you know, how do you think of the institution, right? Right, you're basically not supposed to think of it as a collective enterprise. You know, you're supposed to think of your time in this kind of completely individuated way, and that you don't have any relation or, you know, collective feeling towards anyone else, right? So, no, I didn't really answer your question, just said some words.
So we have one question here, and then we'll move to the next speaker. We'll return to these in the discussion, I think. But yeah.
My question is, do you think the plenum is transportable to here? And is this a call for something like a plenum instead of a conference? And don't you think the conference is an attempt to build solidarities? Do you think the plenum comes out of, you know, that very complex history of Yugoslavia and Balkanization?
The Balkanization of the Balkans.
Yeah, and just, you know, that tripod of the non-alignment, anti-fascism,
Yeah.
and self-organization, it's very rooted in that. So do you think that it can be transported? Do you think we can activate it? And is that what you're calling for?
Well, look, I mean, I wanted to mention them just because, as I said, I'm bored of this kind of discourse of failure and blah, blah, blah. So I just wanted to say, look, these are things that really work. I mean, I don't see why you couldn't transport them. I mean, something like Occupy and prefigurative politics and direct democracy, you know, were genuine attempts at, like, this kind of thing. You know, look, I don't want to do that kind of historical determinist thing where it's like, oh, because of Yugoslavia, therefore plenums, you know? Look, I mean, there are problems, but I think we have to, I mean, that's why I want to start with the law. It's like, look, how do these things get constructed and, repeated? But basically people in the plenums in Bosnia and Zagreb and Macedonia are young, right? These are people who don't remember the war even, right? These are people who are born in, like, 1990, you know? And I think this I don't know.
But there is a kind of transgenerational transmission, I think, that goes on, and I think it's very relevant, your call for the plenum here, because of the moment of austerity in Yugoslavia, and the collapse of Yugoslavia under the pressure of having to pay back these extraordinary loans to the IMF.
Yeah.
And it's the relationship of that to what's happening in Greece and happening in Europe right now. So it's extremely relevant.
No, I agree completely. It's obviously right. I mean, everyone's looking to Greece. Everyone's thinking about what's going to happen in this sense, because, what does it mean to think of yourself as the periphery, for example, as the, brutally asset-stripped, periphery, right? What does it mean to be against the EU from the left, right? Not Cameron's fucking anti-Europe shit, but, like, to be against the EU from, like, a position of protest and, like, resistance. And of course, I mean, the relationship between Greece and former Yugoslavia now is absolutely key. But this is what's going to happen, right?
The threat, if Syriza fails, what is the consequences for Europe? Also, if we have a failed state with Italy, which is on the cards, and if the EU experiment fails, what then? I mean, even how to think this question from the left is a very important and relevant question.
Yeah, I agree.
We'll return to that, I think, in the discussion, and we'll also return to it actually later this afternoon in the conversation with Sarika Lee. So I think it would be good now to, if you...